QSO Today, Episode 311, Riley Hollingsworth K4ZDH. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver, more on this later, and by QRP Labs, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver and a whole host of parts and kits for the ham radio builder. Both of those companies will be in the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo as exhibitors on the floor. Look for them. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. On the QSO Today homepage is a menu item called Expo in the upper right corner of the screen. If you click on it, it will take you to more information about the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. Me and my team are building out a virtual ham radio convention that includes speakers, exhibitors, prizes, and more. This week we passed over 10,000 attendees signed up for our event that begins with Dr. Scott Wright, K0MD's keynote address. Please click on the banner ad in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Expo website and sign up for your free ticket. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric K4ZDH, your host. Riley Hollingsworth, K4ZDH, started his ham radio career in Rock Hill, South Carolina in the 1960s and proceeded to law school and to a career at the FCC, or Federal Communications Commission. Riley was part of the evolution of the FCC as it dealt with paging, cellular, PCS, and amateur radio. K4ZDH tells his amateur radio story, as well as his impact on the amateur radio service through his career at the FCC. K4ZDH, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Riley?
Yes, I sure am.
Riley, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, with me, it started with a little shortwave radio that my uncle had. I think it was one of those Zeniths. It wasn't a space spanner, but one of the bigger Zenith radios, and he would tune around the frequencies with me, and we'd hear some ham radio operators. And then I ended up getting a night kit, space spanner radio kit for, I think, 1995, which I still have to this day. I'm looking at it now, and that was in 1960. And I built that and heard ham operators. And then one day he said, I know an amateur operator here in town. I'll take you over there to meet him sometime. My uncle didn't have a license himself, but he knew a couple of the ham operators. So he took me over to meet a fellow. And as it turns out, this fellow was Morris Hall in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And he had the Collins outfit from the 60s, and I don't know if that was they call them gray boxes or black boxes or whatever, but once you've seen a full Collins station like that with the big amplifier that was approximately the size of our refrigerator, you don't ever forget that. And so I immediately talked to him about getting a license. He took me to my first ham fest, which was in Shelby, North Carolina, at the state park there, and within a few months I had my license. I was able to learn the code pretty fast thanks to his practice with me. And so I was a very active ham operator until college, and I got out of it for a couple of years, got back into it right before law school. And when I got out of law school, I decided to come with the FCC. I had a chance to go to Columbia, South Carolina.
Don't tell the whole story, because I have to ask you questions along the way, right?
Gotcha. All right, great.
Okay, so you got your first license. Do you remember Morris Hall's call sign?
W4CX, I believe.
Would you say that he was your first Elmer?
Yeah, he was. I had 2 or 3 Elmers all at the same time. They were really helpful. And I had Grady Horton, K4TZG, was the main Elmer. I guess I learned most of my code from him.
Did you belong to any amateur radio clubs while you were a teenager?
No, I took the classes that a local club there had offered, but I wasn't a member of the club.
I think I read someplace that your first license was in 1961. What was your call sign?
KN4ZDH was the first call sign.
But there was a problem, wasn't there, when your father read the license?
Yeah, I was working at a little country store and gas station, and my license actually was dated July 20th, 1960. That's when I first got my novice license. So anyway, my dad calls me at the store and said, your license came, and it says novice. And I said, what is the call sign? And so in those days, they were manually typed. And the way this was typed on the line for the call sign, the Z in ZDH was a little bit too low, and it looked like a 7. So he said, it's KN47DH. And I'm thinking, oh, no, they've messed up my call sign. Now I won't be able to get on. I got to contact the FCC. But when I got home and looked at it, I could tell that it was KN4ZDH. And my first contact that night was on 80 meters, and it was with a fellow in Richmond, Earl Savage, fellow in Richmond, Virginia. And he took special pains to slow down, and we talked for quite a long time, and then I got a card from him. And years and years later, this was in 1960, in 1999, when I got back into amateur radio big time, I located Earl Savage, and he still lived in Richmond, and he was in a nursing home, but still lucid, and he had been a teacher, a retired teacher, and I should have known that given the amount of time that he spent with me. But I never forgot that first contact, and I think the old-time people like myself never forget the first contact. I don't know about newer licensees because you can make thousands more contacts now than we could in those days with crystals and AM transmitters and so forth.
Do you remember your first rig?
Yeah, first rig was E.F. Johnson Challenger. I'm looking at it right now. I still have it, and a Hallicrafters SX110 receiver. Now, that was the first rig that I had. Now, of course, some ham operators loaned me, I think it was a DX60 or something like that, and a basic receiver. But the first rig that I got myself was the E.F. Johnson Challenger and the Hallicrafters SX110.
And what's the current rig?
Current rig, I have a Yaesu FT920, and I have a Kenwood TS520. I did get the ICOM 7300 recently, which I used most of the time. And I have some Drake equipment, a Drake 2NT and a 2C and a 2B. I always liked the Drake equipment. And when I traded the Challenger, I got a Valiant. And when I traded a Valiant, I got an HT37 and went on sideband, which I still have here.
So you have multiple operating positions, right, in your shack?
Yes, I do.
How did you divide them up?
Well, I have 3 different old desks. And on one desk, I have an amplifier in the FT920. The Yaesu FT920 has always been my favorite rig. I think they stopped making it too early. It was a rig ahead of its time. For example, it had the pulsing circuit to tune an amplifier and things like that, which only came out in the other rigs later on. And so I have one vintage desk, which is the Drake tube rigs, the 2NT and the 2C, and the HT37. Now, a good friend of mine in South Carolina, who's 96, recently called, I guess last year, and said, I got a Collins 75A4 here that's been restored, and I'm trying to thin out my equipment. I don't know what's going to happen in the next few years, and so I'd like for you to come get this thing if you would. So with the HT37, I'm using a Collins 75A4, which by coincidence was, or by chance, was refurbished by Howard Mills, the Collins restoration guy down in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. So it's a beauty.
Did I see in a picture that you might have an S-line too?
No, at one time I had an S-line, I guess 75S3 maybe, I'm not sure, for a brief time. But S-line was something. I used to daydream in the Allied radio catalogs. It would show the Collins S-lines in there, and of course could never have afforded one. But the beam that I have a TA-33 beam, which I got from Allied Radio in 1961. And I got the TA-33 beam, 100 feet of coax, and 100 feet of rotor cable, and an AR-22 rotor that came with it for $125. But I'm still using the beam. It's out back, and I've had to replace, the traps a couple of times. And I know there are probably better antennas, but I'm really attached to it, so I'll never take that thing down. That'll go down when I go down, I guess.
Now, in 1961, $130 was a month's salary for a lot of people.
That was a big price then, but then when you look at what they cost now,
right,
particularly with cable and everything,
almost a month's salary.
Yeah.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Yeah, It did really. Ham radio taught me that I did have an ability in technical things, a little bit anyway. I wasn't good at math. I think I would have been better at math had it been taught differently. But anyway, ham radio told me that I could do technical things, and I really enjoyed it. And so when I got out of law school, I wanted to go to the FCC. I had a choice of going to the FCC or going into law practice with my cousin down in South Carolina. But he told me one day, he said, you can start tomorrow if you want to, but I want to tell you, I do divorces, sewer easements, and taxes. And he said, if you think you'll be fascinated by that, you can start tomorrow. And I said, well, I think I'll go to the FCC for a couple of years and see how that is. And so I planned to stay 3 years, and every year I liked it better and better, so I ended up retiring from the FCC. And, of course, the highlight of that, I had some very good periods there. The explosion in cellular and land mobile radio was interesting, the cable TV area. But my favorite part was when I got to restart the amateur radio enforcement program, which had been dormant for 12 years.
It's my understanding, though, in the mid-'70s, you were a Nader's Raider. What made you a Nader's Raider, and what did you do there?
Well, I was interested in it because they were studying bisonosis, or it's called brown lung disease, in textile mills in the Carolinas. And I had read about it. My grandfather worked for the Victoria textile mill in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and he came home every day covered with cotton dust. And so we grew up in a textile era, and I think Rock Hill, South Carolina had about 5 or 6 mills at the time, all cotton mills. And so I just wrote a letter to Nader, and
that was Ralph Nader you're referring to, right?
Yes.
Who was a big consumer advocate in the 60s and 70s, right?
Oh yeah, it was a big deal. The Nader's Raiders were a big deal. So I wrote him and got a letter back from somebody in the office there saying, coincidentally, we want to look at all the textile mills in the Carolinas. And if you're willing to do it, we'd like to see if you can get into them and interview some workers and so forth. And so I took them up on that, and most of the mills were very cooperative, and I could go right into the mill and talk to the workers on the floor. Very, very interesting summer. In fact, it went on into the next summer a little bit because I was exploring some North Carolina mills, but I went to every textile mill in South Carolina that summer.
What was the biggest takeaway from working for Ralph Nader and making those interviews there?
I think the biggest takeaway was how hard these folks worked in the textile mills, especially the shift workers. And at that time, brown lung disease had been recognized in England for 50 or 60 years, but it was not recognized in the United States. Black lung disease that coal miners get was recognized as a workman's compensation injury or illness, but brown lung disease wasn't. And that's what I was interested in. And the textile mills were very cooperative, actually. In fact, there was I'll let you go on with the question.
I'm actually interested in how the story turned out. Was brown lung disease eventually recognized as a result of your efforts?
Yes, as a result of a lot of effort. They were looking at those all over the country, but textiles were very prevalent in the South. And some years later, it became a compensable disease.
I actually had never heard of brown lung disease, and I would never have thought that working in a textile mill would have been dangerous. Now, are we talking about people who are actually making fabric there, and that's where this occurs, or is this people who work with fabric and are making clothes, for example?
Well, it's called bisonosis is the name for it, and it's earlier in the process. The problem is when they cut open the cotton bales and the cotton fiber and dust that comes out of the cotton bale. That's where bisonosis. Those that are running the weaving machines or whatever they call them, it's not there. It's where the bales come in and they're cut open. And that's what my grandfather did, coincidentally, and that's why he has had vivid memories of his coming home from the mill every day, just covered in cotton dust. In fact, he had an air compressor out behind the house, and he'd blow all the cotton dust off of himself before he came in the house. It was a rule that my grandmother had.
So the dust that we're talking about is the dirt from the field that was also on the cotton, right? They're opening the bales before the cotton is washed and actually spun and turned into fabric.
Right, and I don't know that it was the dirt. I think it was the particles from the cotton and the seed, because after you cut it open, it's got to be separated and refined a little bit before you can do anything with it, or polished, I should say.
I learn something new all the time. I grew up in Southern California, so we didn't know anything about cotton in those days. And frankly, I didn't know anything about it now. This is quite interesting to me. Now, you said you went to law school. Where did you go to law school?
Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get out and be active with ICOM's new IC705 and its optional multifunction backpack. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion, as it has many of the same base station features and functionality of ICOM's bigger rigs. At the tip of your fingers, in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilo, or just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. The ICOM IC705 has a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall, similar to the IC7300. I can't wait to get my IC705 to use as a baseband rig for satellites and microwave projects, including the S-HALE geosynchronous satellite. The ICOM IC705 puts out 5 watts with its BP272 battery pack and a full 10 watts when connected to an external 13.8-volt power supply. The rig does single sideband, CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Other features include micro USB connector, Bluetooth and wireless LAN over Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, a micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment. As this is the perfect QRP or QRPP rig, the perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional LC192 backpack with its special compartment for the IC705 and room for accessories for soda activations or just a day social distancing in the park. For more information on this fabulous new rig, click on the banner in this week's show notes. And when you go to buy your new ICOM IC705, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. And why the FCC? I mean, was the FCC recruiting at your law school in those days? How did you think that you might want to work for them?
They were recruiting, and I was still very interested in amateur radio and still active as much as I could be. To be in school, I didn't have any equipment at law school, but I would come home every couple of weekends or 4 or 5 weekends to South Carolina where my equipment was set up, and I would get on, make a few contacts. So they came through colleges down there recruiting, and I decided to see what it was all about. And at that time, cable was really big, really about to explode. And also the land mobile industry was paging, two-way radio, and then later on trunking system. So it looked like it'd be very interesting, and I got to travel a lot. And our job was to help the small business and figure out how in the world to navigate through the regulation. And I always liked that because I saw a lot of tiny companies become real big companies, and I just stayed year after year. I had good bosses and good cases and good experiences. I really liked it.
Let's go there for a second. I actually got my start in land mobile in the 70s. In the late 70s, the 800 megahertz band was opening up. I think I've said this maybe the last few weeks on the QSO Today podcast that I remember that we weren't even sure that 800 megahertz would work for land mobile. It was like this experiment that was beginning to happen. How did that look at the FCC when these new bands were opening up and this idea of trunked radio was starting? What was your role in that, and how did it look from your perspective?
Well, it looked like it had great potential in the cities, and it just exploded, as you said, and we saw a lot of small companies, a lot of mom-and-pop operations that were doing two-way paging get into 800 megahertz. And my job was, after a while, a number of companies would file for additional channels, claiming that they had a certain number of mobiles. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but if you had a certain number of customers, you could get 5 channels. If you had a certain number, you could get 10 channels or 15. And it became apparent that some of these companies could not possibly really have the number of customers that would justify that many channels. But having more channels gave them a leg up on the competitors. So my first land mobile job was to look at the loading of the 13 major cities in the U.S. and take back channels where loading had been doctored up or falsified. For example, if you're in a city and you're looking at one of the land mobile licensees in the trunk system, and they show 175 mobiles to a florist company, you know something's wrong, because there's probably not a city in America, maybe New York City or Los Angeles, that has 175 florist trucks running around. So we audited those and got back a lot of the channels to give to smaller businesses who couldn't get channels because they were all taken. So we helped to balance out the market, so to speak.
I seem to think that the FCC changed or evolved about this time, maybe when cellular and PCS started, where spectrum was then being sold at auction. I don't recall in the land mobile industry that you had to pay a lot for a license to have
No, you didn't.
UHF channels or even trunk channels, but it seemed to me that somehow the FCC changed over that period as the big players came in.
Well, what happened was it didn't cost much to get a license, but what we found was somebody would get a license, and we noticed it was quickly sold or transferred or assigned, I guess is the correct term. And we started seeing some of these cases, and they were getting vast amounts of money for this. And so the idea came up, well, if they're going to get the channels just to sell them for the highest bidder, then maybe the FCC should do that and just auction them off in the first place so the money goes to the taxpayers, into the Treasury. So that was the impetus behind the auction. So many people were getting a 5-channel block and immediately reselling it, that all we were doing was granting these channels to resellers. And so that led to auctions, which seemed like a very ridiculous idea at the time. I remember people laughing at it, but of course, auctions were the big thing, and that's how they got assigned later on.
Tens of millions of dollars were raised by the FCC, weren't they, from these spectrum auctions, first with these trunk channels, but then later with PCS and cellular?
Yeah, there's been hundreds of millions of dollars raised through those auctions.
And how did that impact the FCC? It seems like as that was happening, the FCC was getting smaller?
Over the years, yeah, the FCC was getting smaller, but the auctions, they had some very smart people handling the auction process, which was computerized after it got started. So the auctions were a great success, and it worked. The whole process just worked. At the same time, though, you started getting pressures to reduce the size of government. So at the same time, the FCC was getting smaller. Now, it could get smaller in the licensing area because that was automated. Auctions were more or less automated. But in recent years, you've seen it get smaller in the enforcement area, which is not a good development.
I remember that, like every major city in Orange County, the FCC had a huge property in the middle of the county where they had their antennas and their monitoring stations. And I think that probably every major city had an FCC monitoring station. Was this reduction in government the reason that these went away?
Yeah. Just we're coming off of 20 years now of reducing government, big government to little government, and something's got to give. They have half the number of field offices that they had even 10 or 12 years ago. But the thing is, the huge real estate that you saw was the antenna system. Now, the FCC still has its 12 or 13 antenna fields around the country. It's just that with the evolution of computers and the Intel chip and so forth, they didn't need to have somebody sitting right there doing the monitoring anymore. All of the fields are tied into the High-Frequency Direction Finding Center in Columbia, Maryland. And so you don't need all those field offices just for the antennas. But you do need bigger field offices in the bigger cities, which they are suffering in that regard because they have half the number of engineers and less than half the number of field offices. But the monitoring still continues.
So the issues of spectrum enforcement or the issues of abuse on radio frequencies has not gone away. In fact, maybe it's increased?
It hasn't gone away. You would think it would be a lot worse than it is. But in regard to amateur frequencies, some of it is the sign of the times. It's just the way society is today. People are more rude, and they're selfish, they're thin-skinned, and sometimes when you're trying to do somebody a favor, they get suspicious. And so you see that attitude in shopping centers or at the beach or whatever. People are just different these days. For example, 25 years ago, if somebody got an official observer notice from the league about something wrong with their signal, they would be grateful because they would think, well, I'm sure glad I heard from the league rather than the FCC. But in today's society, even when you're trying to do somebody a favor, they will often take offense. We didn't have road rage in those days and all the crazy things that we have. It's just people are different these days. And so I think that's the main reason for some of the conduct problems on the amateur bands. mostly 75 meters. But overall, considering the number of licensees we have, overall everything works really good.
You were saying earlier that you became involved in amateur radio enforcement. How did that happen, and what happened there?
Well, I had worked in the land mobile area, and then later moved to the Gettysburg office to work more specifically in land mobile licensing and just general licensing. We had meetings at headquarters about once a week, so I was down for a meeting, and Rich Lee, the Enforcement Bureau chief, showed me a letter that the league had written, and I wasn't all that active at that particular time. Maybe I made 20 contacts a year or something, but I was focused on other things. But the letter implored the commission to get back into amateur radio because nothing had been done for 12 years. And Rich said, what's this about? And I said, well, it's been a 12-year hiatus in this service because of the explosion of land mobile and trunking and cellular and everything else. They just haven't had the staff. And he said, well, how many amateur licensees are there? And I think at that point there's about 650 to 700,000, somewhere along in there. And I told him, and he said, well, we can't have a large group of licensees thinking they're getting no service from the FCC, no enforcement. I'm going to look into this. And so he did, and about a month later, he called and said, I'm still looking into this, and I can't get anything going. Would you be willing to see what you can do with this program and to get enforcement started? And I said I would, but I'd be very interested in doing it, but I did not want to leave the Gettysburg office. And I said, I don't know if it can be done, Rich, because 12 years is a long time to have no enforcement. And he said, well, I'll make a deal with you. He said, you get it straightened out. I won't be breathing down your neck. I won't micromanage you. And if you can't do it, you'll be cooking squirrel under a bridge somewhere later on. And I said, well, that's a great deal, Rich. I'll take you up on that. So I did it. He basically left me alone. And, of course, it was like it was the reason it went so well was because nothing had been done. I mean, if you lived beside an old house for 12 years and nobody had maintained it or painted it, anybody could come rambling up there and paint it and improve it, and it would look wonderful. So I started from zero, and we had 99.9% cooperation from the amateur service. And so it was just the right time and the right place, and they were welcoming enforcement because nothing had been done for so long.
Well, what did enforcement look like to amateur radio operators when you came on and reinitiated the program there at the FCC?
Well, it was a lot of deliberate interference and arguing. You had different factions on 75 meters, and you had a faction on 20 meters, and just a lot of things that if somebody that wasn't an amateur operator, well, even an amateur operator, you'd listen to it and you'd be embarrassed, and you'd think, this is the amateur service. This sounds more like the end days of the CV service. So it was the broken window theory. You know, if you let the windows get broken out of an old building, it just gets worse and worse. But if you do minimum maintenance on it and show up and ask what's going on and talk to this group one-on-one and say, look, you guys can do this, but do you really want to do it? If you're having that much trouble with the frequency, look at your radio and you'll see one big knob, and that's to change frequencies. Every radio that's ever been made in the amateur service has one big knob. And just don't get into this, because if you do, we're coming after you because we can find other violations in there. And I think just having some attention paid to it made a world of difference.
I think you have a presentation up on YouTube or something called One Big Knob. Is that right?
I think so, yeah.
Hey, this is Eric for just another short break. One of my favorite ham radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, hosted by George, KJ6VU, my guest in episode 232, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy take a bi-weekly deep dive into their favorite ham radio workbench projects and the technologies that fascinate them. If you want to be a ham radio builder or just be inspired, click on the link in this week's show notes page.
Do you have any enforcement stories in the amateur division that might interest the listeners? Something that was incredibly outside of what we would think would happen in the amateur bands?
I have a lot of enforcement stories. I won't bore you with them, but I think the one that I remember the most is when I started listening heavily on the amateur bands again. As I said, when I got started in this again, I wasn't that active, but I was appalled at what things sounded like and how people acted and deliberately jammed each other and so forth. And it bothered me all through the weekends. It was never off, and I would monitor a lot over the weekend, but it ruined a lot of weekends. But one Friday afternoon, I was sitting there particularly aggravated over a case in Georgia. And I'm thinking, now this is probably going to ruin my weekend. Maybe I should just try to call the guy and talk to him one-on-one, because that works a lot. It works well a lot of times if you can talk to somebody one-on-one. So I decided to do it because I know if I didn't do it, it would probably ruin my whole weekend. So about 5:30, I called down, and his wife answered the phone, and I said, I told her who it was, and I'd like to speak to the amateur radio operator there, Mr. So-and-so. And she said, well, he gets home at 6. What's this about? And so, against my better judgment, I told her that we'd gotten a ton of complaints. We had tapes submitted and so forth of the conduct that was coming from the station and so forth, and the deliberate interference and so forth. And there was a little bit of a pause, and I said, just have him call me when he comes in, if you wouldn't. I gave her my number, and there was a little bit of a pause, and she said, well, he won't have to call you. And I said, well, I really would like for him to call me. I just need to talk to him for a few minutes. And she said, you won't need to talk to him because, as I said, he gets home about 6. And I can guarantee you that after 6:15 tonight, you will never have this problem again. And we didn't. And I never heard anything from him or about him after that. So I don't know what she did, but it solved the problem. And then I found out that the best enforcement tool in the world sometimes is a wife or girlfriend standing in the door of the radio room unnoticed.
And you didn't have to check a police blotter for his local neighborhood to see if anything happened that night?
I often wondered whatever happened to him, but I'll take enforcement. At that time, we'd take enforcement any way we could get it, so we just left it alone. But as far as I know, he was never on the radio again. He could be buried in the backyard for all I know.
Something like that, right? So how has, under your tutelage, how did that end up evolving? And does the FCC still enforce this way today?
Well, like I say, 99% of the amateur operators wanted enforcement. They were very appreciative of it because they had been neglected for so many years. So it evolved in just more self-policing, which is what we're supposed to be doing anyway. And people just got more conscious of it, more aware of it. And it's like the seatbelt. When they came out, they wouldn't pull you over for not wearing a seatbelt. It had to be some other violation. But I noticed, and I did the same thing, that when people would see a police car, they would naturally reach over and feel, make sure they had the seatbelt on. It's just the awareness that enforcement is out there. Just the general awareness changes a lot of attitude. And if they had the feeling that the bands were neglected by the FCC, then why should they care about them? So just raising the awareness of what the service is supposed to be doing and what it's supposed to be accomplishing, and knowing that somebody cared about it from the entity that licensed it in the first place, I think makes the difference. And
does the FCC still have an enforcement bureau?
Oh, yes, definitely. They're stretched pretty thin. They have a lot more issues. It's not just about RF anymore. If any of the listeners want to see just briefly what the FCC does on any given week, just go to fcc.gov and search the Daily Digest, and you'll see a whole page of all the actions that the FCC did the day before or in the days before. And you'd be amazed at the things on there that aren't just about RF anymore. They have a huge responsibility just in non-RF areas. And those non-RF areas would be like telecommunications, the internet, things like that, right? Yeah, robocalls, universal service fund fraud, and things like that. It's not just about monitoring. I'm lucky I don't get robocalls, but when I visit my father in America, these calls come in every night. There could be 6 or 7 calls every night. What can people in America do about robocalls? Is there anything they can do? Well, they're banned. In fact, the Supreme Court just ruled that you can ban robocalls, and they did not allow the exception for calls from the government or bill collecting. So robocalls are banned, and there are some very huge forfeitures or fines that are given to these robocallers. I personally like the robo detector program on my cell phone that would put in, it was a little program where when a robocall came in, I don't know exactly how it detected robocalls, but it would be some celebrity like Cher saying, oh, you've gotten me right during I'm on a break in my concert. Just give me a few minutes and I'll get right back to you. Or it'll be a little kid on there asking a lot of questions. Just something that took up so much time from the robocaller that they end up disconnecting. But robocalls are not legal, and the Supreme Court just upheld that this week, actually.
Is there like some international enforcement? Because those robocalls could actually be coming from offshore.
I don't know how they do it. They work with the telephone company and the cellular carriers.
Yeah, unfortunately, my father just doesn't answer the phone anymore. So it's kind of like made the phone practically useless.
Yeah, it's very annoying. Now, we don't have them to that degree here. Nowadays, they've been getting less and less. In fact, the two programs I have on, the program I have on my phone hasn't detected anything in the last 6 or 8 months. So they're being reduced a lot. But the forfeitures, the fines are huge, just like in the old days of mass fax going out to people.
Out of curiosity, do people operating cellular phones in America, do they pay for airtime in both directions? So if you receive an incoming call, are you actually paying for the airtime?
No, not anymore. In fact, long-distance calls are free, and all you're really paying for is cellular data, I think, and, of course, the unit itself. But there's unlimited long distance. Unlimited long distance and the cellular data plans are very, very generous. So I have the same phone bill every month. And, in fact, last summer, I made about 300 calls in a period of 2 to 3 months setting up this volunteer monitor program. Yet my bill stayed the same.
You just mentioned the volunteer monitor program. That was my next question. What is the volunteer monitor program?
Well, as the FCC was gradually cut back, the staff since, the League for 50 years has had the Official Observer Program. So the FCC suggested in 2017 that maybe the League would want to beef up the Official Observer Program and rebrand it and have better training and better management. And in exchange for that, the FCC would work with the volunteer monitors and take cases that they referred and handle them on an expedited basis, because they knew that they no longer had the resources to send field engineers out to monitor for several days trying to get enforcement evidence. So the League Board approved it, and the Volunteer Monitor Program is the old Official Observer Program on speed, so to speak. And the deal is that we have better training, better coordination, fewer number. We have 195 volunteer monitors. That is much more manageable than having 500 or 600 official observers, although out of that 500 or 600, there were maybe 200, 250 that were active. So the League helped in the training, and the League participates in webinars that we have for the volunteer monitors. And what we do is just voluntarily monitor the bands, and serious rule discrepancies, we send a notice out, an advisory notice first, and if it continues 2 or 3 times, then it goes to the FCC, and they promise that when a case comes from the Volunteer Monitor Program, they'll give it expedited action so that it doesn't just get in queue in the online complaint process. And also, they wanted rebranding, as I said, so we totally changed the name of it. We have a volunteer council, volunteer examiner, so we decided we should probably call it a volunteer monitor program. But we also send out, and the FCC wanted this, good operator notice, which are recognitions that we do quarterly of 10 or 15 cases of outstanding operation. And the last quarter was the first time we had done that, the quarter ending at the end of March. And as it turns out, several of those getting the good operator notices were teenagers that had just gotten into amateur radio. So we were pretty happy about that.
Now, are you using some kind of technology now? I mean, I think I remember the official observers would actually send out handwritten postcards. Or ARRL volunteer monitor stations, are they actually using some kind of infrastructure now to make their reports? Some larger system generates those messages?
It's not automated yet. It would be were it not for the shutdown, from the coronavirus. They're sent out by hand, but they are written notices. And where we can, we deal with the apparent discrepancy by one-on-one contact, as I said earlier. That seems to work in a lot of cases, or by email, if we can find an email address. And in every case but one, we've gotten a quick response back saying, I appreciate you pointing this out to me. I thought I could do FT8 on a certain frequency as a technician. Now I understand I can't, or something like that. So I think it's working very well, because we have dozens and dozens of cases where we contacted the person and pointed out some element of the operation, such as out of band, and they immediately responded, and the problem stopped. And that's the whole point. of enforcement. So we have a couple of cases that we have referred to the FCC, and they're doing the direction finding to locate the interference and so forth. But overall, we've been able to handle it in-house, which is the whole point, because amateur radio is supposed to be self-policing.
Up until recently, you were the ARRL Atlantic Division Vice Director. How important are the regional directors and vice directors to amateur radio around the U.S., and what is their role?
Well, there are directors and vice directors. When you say regional director, that is a term used for the FCC office. There are three of them, three regional directors. So the league's directors are just that, division directors. You have 13 divisions, such as the Atlantic Division and the Southwestern Division and so forth. And they all have vice directors. And the directors and their section managers are the ones that do all the work, and they go to all the amateur meetings, the Hamfest, the club meetings, and talk to the amateur operators and listen to their issues and what they want. And then they meet twice a year, although they're communicating all the time. They have board meetings twice a year in Newington. They're at league headquarters. This year it will be by Zoom, I'm sure. And they decide, the course of amateur radio, and if they get a lot of interest from certain amateurs about a different area of amateur radio or a different license class or different privileges or something, they work on that. And for example, there's an issue with a number of homeowners associations not allowing amateur radio antennas. So it's the directors and the league that deal with that and try to deal with Congress and the FCC and so forth. So the directors are very important, because really there's nobody else representing amateur radio operators except the American Radio Relay League over here anyway.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. Let's go to homeowners associations for a second. Did you have the homeowners association issues when you were at the FCC? Does the FCC really have any legal teeth over homeowners associations?
The issues were starting to come in because such a huge percentage of people now, when they move into a housing development. But the FCC had PRB1, it was called, which was a policy statement requiring reasonable accommodation to amateur radio antennas. And then there's the OTARD rule, over-the-air devices, where they have to be allowed. But the number of homeowner associations has exploded in the last 10 years. And a lot of times what they do is one association copies another association's bylaws and rules. Somebody wants to start a housing development, they get a copy of that. And in so many cases, it just blatantly or blindly doesn't allow any outside antenna. So that's a concern in the amateur radio service. And they're working on that now to broaden PRB1. A lot of the homeowners associations are very cooperative once they understand what it is, that amateur radio antenna doesn't mean it's a huge tower with a great big beam on top of it. That an amateur radio antenna can be a wire antenna. So they need to be educated a little bit too. And there's some effort to get Congress to recognize amateur radio in the sense that you have to be allowed to put up an antenna. For example, there's a flagpole law. A homeowners association can't prevent you from putting up a flagpole for the American flag. Now there's height limits and so forth, but they want a lot of people want a similar law or rule for amateur radio antennas, just from a public service standpoint, because as you know, the internet is as fragile as it is fascinating. But since amateur radio has no central infrastructure, it can't be taken down. power goes off, you just run on the battery. There's no infrastructure that will bring the whole thing down. Amateur radio really is the only fail-safe system there is. Cellular can easily be brought down, and as you know, the internet can. But amateur radio is not, because we have our individual stations, individual equipment, and low power requirements. And power can go off tomorrow, or the internet can go completely down. We can still talk all over the world.
Do you think the amateur radio community does a good job at transmitting the benefit and values of amateur radio to the general public?
I think they could do better. When I was growing up in South Carolina, everybody knew the amateur radio operators in town. But now you have the internet, you have cable and cellular and everything, and they are not so aware of it. Plus, amateur radio operators are technically oriented. And you saw the same thing with NASA. There were hundreds and hundreds of wonderful inventions, such as Teflon, that came out of the NASA, early days of the Apollo program and NASA programs. But they're scientists and engineers, and they work more on logic, and they don't advertise themselves. They're not in the public relations business. So I don't think amateur radio operators have really been as successful as they could be in publicizing the value of it to the general public.
Do you think that's the role of the ARRL?
It's a big role, yes. And they sponsor numerous education programs in the schools, and they have a teachers program where they will get teachers licensed, and in science labs and so forth, they support that. They work very closely with the STEM program, science, technology, engineering, and math, to factor in amateur radio.
What's your favorite operating mode?
I like CW best. I guess just because I grew up with it.
That's the whole zen of CW, right?
Exactly. I thought myself, and I was often asked about whether eliminating the requirement of Morse code would do any damage to amateur radio. Well, it didn't do any damage to it. I never noticed any difference in enforcement when the code was eliminated. But what it has done is make it a lot more interesting to a lot of people, maybe to most people. And the people that make the code keyers and the automatic keyers and the benchers and the paddles and the straight keys, they tell me that business is better than ever. And I think because there may be some analogy to the required reading list in high school. The best way to ruin a good book was to put it on the required reading list. And you're thinking, oh no, I've got to read this book. But later in life, you'd be drawn to that. You would remember that, and maybe you'd go get that book. But I think a lot of young people have interest in CW because they're getting a little bored with instant messenger and things like that. And it's a language that their peers don't know. But I've run into lots of young people that are just fascinated and very good in CW operation.
Young people might be developing a glass wrist by using smartphones and typing with their thumbs, right? So,
yeah, exactly. I ran into a 15-year-old girl up in the Chambersburg area last year that was at 30 words a minute, and she taught herself to send with her left hand so she could take notes at the same time she was doing the code. But I've just run into so many young people that are just fascinated with it. And I noticed that, of course, we haven't had any lately because of the coronavirus, but at Hamfest, there always seems to be a lot of people around the tables and counters that are selling and showing the paddles and the keyers for Morse code.
And they're beautiful now. I mean, they're almost works of art. Thank God for CNC machines.
That's right. That's right. And I know in my era, you had the J38 if you were lucky. And maybe you had a Vibraplex mechanical bug, which I'm looking at one of those right here. I never quite mastered it. But now you go to these larger Hamfests, and there's all kinds of beautiful keys out there.
You collect them because they're works of art more than things that you actually want to use. I noticed you mentioned that you have Kenwood TS520. You almost have the same rigs on your desk that I have. Was that one of your original rigs and you just never got rid of it?
No, it wasn't. The Kenwood, I bought the Kenwood at a Hamfest. I just always liked the 520. It was a legend. And I liked the dial readouts and so forth. So I picked that up at a Hamfest. It was in mint condition, but I never had one earlier, or had one as a younger person.
What do you think is the greatest challenge facing amateur radio now?
I think keeping the public or making the public aware of what it has to offer and drawing in more and more young people. I'm concerned about our demographics. We're just an aging population, and we have to draw in younger people. And while it's true that you get some younger people in it, and then they go to college, they get married, they get out of it, they don't get into it until later in life. It's just our average age bothers me somewhat. I see the same thing in these big ham meetings that I go to. And I'd like to see the day when if you ask somebody who was under 20 to stand up, it would be a huge number of people rather than a sprinkling of people throughout the audience.
If you had the ability, and you may actually, what should we amateurs do to attract younger people? Or are we maybe the wrong guys to attract younger people?
Well, it's a continuing question that the league deals with. They work with the schools a lot. It's just that younger people have so many distractions these days, from sports to cell phones to computers. It's hard to get them interested in to understand the capabilities of amateur radio. And people say, well, you can't talk all around the world with a cell phone. Well, these kids do. They have WhatsApp, and thanks to Facebook and things like that, a lot of them do know people in other countries. So you can't just say, look, I can talk to China with this device here. It's got to be more than that. And it comes from the science educational programs. For example, out in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the teachers out there and the club had gotten the idea to get a group of kids licensed and teach them how to make a tracking receiver and transmitter and launch it on a high-altitude balloon, and with a video and everything. So I was out there the first time they did it. It was part of their STEM project. And some people thought that it wouldn't work, but they did it, and the balloon went to 89,000 feet and then sent back beautiful pictures. And they were able to track it and locate it when it came down and so forth. Things like that to interest them. It's too bad that the space program is somewhat limited, because that was fascinating to a lot of kids as well.
Do you think multitasking is overrated? I think there was a time when we used to think that a person who could multitask was a person who was kind of blessed. My sense is that we praise multitasking so much now, but that what ends up happening is nobody ends up being a master of one thing.
Exactly. I think that's true, and I think science is showing that multitasking, it may seem efficient, but it can be distracting in some areas as well, and not being efficient, and you're not paying full attention or even enough attention to any individual task.
What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
The new technologies, to see the interest that people have in the digital communications. I'm not into digital communications myself, but the capability of these things to talk all over the world with very low power with a computer interface is just phenomenal. And it seems like it changes every month. You know, one year there's PSK31. The next year, Joe Taylor develops FT8 and gives it to the world, and everybody's fascinated with FT8. Now, that aspect will draw in a lot of younger people. And I think the second thing is the capability of our equipment, the receivers, the digital signal processing is just phenomenal. Now, I mentioned earlier that I had a Challenger transmitter for CW and an SX110, and I set those up together a few years ago and tried to get on the air, looked at my original logbook from 1960, and I made an awful lot of contacts on those two pieces of equipment, and I don't know how we did it when I listen today. I don't know how in the world did we make all those contacts, and I loved it at the time, made a lot of contacts, but I just couldn't do it today because I'm so used to the signal processing of our more modern receivers, and the fact that the transceiver and the transmitter, you can frequency hop all over the bands, and in those days you tended to stick to one or two frequencies, and you had to, of course, if you were crystal control, but you just didn't get on all the bands. And I know when I turn on even the FT920, I'll check out 20 meters and see what that sounds like, then 17, and then 40, 30 meters maybe, and then pick one to get on. But with our old mechanical equipment like the Drakes and Collins, the Hallicrafters, you'd wear the thing out, jumping all over the bands to see what was on. But with our equipment now, in a matter of a few minutes, you can get a general assessment of all of the bands, especially with the computer programs that you can access that will show you the DX on any given band or the band conditions. Now, the danger of the computer interfaces, we don't want amateur radio to be dependent on the Internet. And I think it's done a good job of keeping its independence from that. But the Internet is a wonderful tool, and the signal processing and the the computer screens and the spectrum analyzers and so forth. We have amazing tools, and it seems like every month there's another amazing thing that you can do in amateur radio.
It's mind-blowing, I think.
It is. Absolutely is.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Well, for the ones coming back into it, I would say you're going to be absolutely amazed at the capabilities of the equipment now. Instead of 80 pounds for the transmitter to do 150 watts, you can have 12 or 13 pounds for a 100-watt transceiver, 100-watt transmitter and receiver that's digital, and it's just and automatically tunes, and it's just absolutely amazing. You'd be amazed at or shocked at the capability of the new equipment, and because of that, it's a lot more fun. You're not so restricted to a certain frequency or a certain band. And for the new people that are coming, that are getting into it, I would say just get on and experiment, and you're going to make mistakes. That's what amateur radio is about. It's about learning, and you're never going to get in trouble making an honest mistake on amateur radio. Just get in there and explore everything you can and see what interests you the most and pursue that, because there's dozens and dozens of modes and things to do, from contesting to DX to CW, FTA, and PSK 31. It's just a whole world of things to be interested in. It's easy to do it.
Riley, I think this is a great place for us to say 73. What a pleasure it was to have you. I know that we've been working on it for some time.
Yeah, it took a little while, didn't it?
It did, but it's okay. It was worth every minute. I really appreciate your coming on the QSO Today podcast.
Well, thank you, Eric, and I'll be glad to talk with you again anytime.
73. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Riley. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K4ZDH in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page or the banner ad for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Radio Expo. We are still in early bird ticket status up to the 24th of July. Early birds get extra points on our leaderboard contest for prizes. Get your free ticket now and meet us at the Expo. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages or by using QSO Today in the coupon box at checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor any of these episodes into written text, please push the button in the middle of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on a host of platforms, including Spotify, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and the iTunes Store. A list of these services is on the right side of the show notes pages. Stitcher is still my favorite. My thanks to my friend and colleague Ben Bresky, who makes every QSO Today interview guest and this host sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.